Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. My name's Caroline Fisher. I'm an Assistant Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle, how are you?
Hi Caroline.
So this week we've seen no cases of coronavirus in the ACT, and we're seeing the slow emergence of news about issues other than the coronavirus, particularly our relationship with China. That's in the headlines, and also the resignation of Mike Kelly, the Labor MP from the seat of Eden-Monaro. Before we get to that, the government has released its contact tracing app, COVID Safe. And last week we were talking about the likelihood of Australians downloading the app. What do you think the reception's been like?
I think the initial reception has been good. In the first 24, 48 hours, more people took it up than had been expected by the government. But there's still a long way to go, and the government needs to continue to make its case. But I think people are more accepting of the app and probably somewhat less worried about privacy concerns. It's been, of course, backed by a whole range of health groups, and people are seeing it as a bit of a trade-off. You give minimal information, but it does help if we're going to get to a reasonably early easing of restrictions. It's one of the tools for that.
Okay, so let's turn to China. This week, China threatened to boycott Australian goods if the Australian government continued to push an independent inquiry into the outbreak of the coronavirus in Wuhan. Is this a serious threat?
Well, I think that it is to an extent, but it's also a bit of just overt bullying. We've seen this in China's behaviour before. It's interesting that in Malcolm Turnbull's memoir, which has just been released, he talks about China bullying, and he really gives a scenario as to how it reacts if its policies are criticised. And of course, in this case, its performance has been criticised and a lot of questions asked. Now, some would say that Australia should have been more diplomatic in the way it proposed an inquiry, but I think when you've got a situation where all these economies around the world have been closed down or semi-closed down, and really the whole world has been disrupted, that it is reasonable to say, well, let's have an independent inquiry, get to the bottom of this and see what measures need to be put in place to stop another pandemic arising in the next few years. So China is being sensitive, but I think that its overreaction is really just a way of it trying to hit back when it feels on the back foot.
Okay, so what would boycott from China look like?
I guess a boycott would look like, for example, discouraging Chinese students from coming to our universities, discouraging Chinese tourists. But when you look at the situation we're in, the students are not likely to get here anytime soon anyway, and certainly the tourists won't be getting here. So a boycott mightn't have the sort of teeth that the Chinese would intend. And also, of course, we don't know to what extent China might just back off, to what extent it's just an empty threat. Another measure that they could take, for example, would be to disrupt imports of, say, Australian wine or other products that can always be a lot of tying up bureaucratically of imports, and that's a way of expressing displeasure. But at the moment, we don't know whether this is just going to be rhetoric or whether it's going to be followed up by action.
Okay, so to confuse matters further with China this week, we saw the government being caught off guard at a press conference when the mining magnate Twiggy Forrest brought along a Chinese diplomat to a press conference with the health minister. What was Twiggy Forrest playing at there? Why did he bring him along?
Well, the whole press conference was about Twiggy sourcing testing kits from China, a lot of money, 320 million worth of product, which of course the government will pay for. It's not as though this is a gift, but he did the deal and made much of the relationship he had with the Chinese company. And there was a press conference with Greg Hunt, the health minister, but as you say, Twiggy brought along the Chinese Consul-General to Victoria, who was given a platform to spruik how good China had been in dealing with the virus. Now, Greg Hunt didn't know this was going to happen. The government was very angry. But what it says, I think, is that leading business figures, or a number of business figures, really don't want anything that will rock the boat with China. They tend to be critical of the government standing up and having strong opinions and making calls such as for the inquiry. They say, well, trade is what is important and let's not interfere with that. We saw, for example, also this week, Kerry Stokes, the media magnate, coming out and saying essentially, don't be too critical. He was saying don't be too critical of the wet markets, which of course the Australian government has condemned and said should be changed. So there is a real difference between a number of business leaders and the government on China policy. And what people around the government say is that we have to stand up for an independent policy. We've got to have integrity on these issues, and it might mean some problems in the economic relationship, but really we can't sort of trade our integrity away.
Okay, so these latest events are obviously placing extra strain on the relationship between Australia and China. What do you think the relationship's going to look like into the future?
Well, the relationship wasn't too good before the COVID crisis. We have to put it in that context. China was very critical of Australia, and there's been all the problems with ministerial visits or lack of them. No Prime Minister's been there for years because they haven't been invited. So it was a fairly negative climate. I think it's become more negative, and I think that after all this, there will also be more public concern about China, and there's a lot of talk of trying to reduce the dependency Australia has economically on China. But when you look at how this could be done, really it's fairly limited, very limited, because China will remain extremely important, obviously, for our exports. Minerals, it's absolutely a fundamental market for iron ore and for coal. And yes, there's a different situation with education exports, but overall it's going to be still a very central market, whatever our concerns. And the same for imports, although I think in areas like, for example, medical supplies, this has been a bit of a wake-up call, and there will be more attempts to be self-sufficient in things like that, or diversify sources. However, for products more generally, we certainly don't want to go back to a protectionist era. So the opportunities to diversify are somewhat limited.
Let's shift our attention now to the marginal seat of Eden Monero. So we saw Mike Kelly very regretfully resigning seat yesterday due to health reasons. How important is this by-election going to be for both Scott Morrison and for Anthony Albanese?
I think it will be a very significant by-election, probably especially for Anthony Albanese, because it will be an early test of his electoral pulling power. And as everyone keeps pointing out, no government has won a seat at a by-election from an opposition for a century. So he really does need to hang on to this seat, but it's very marginal. And I think that you could see if the government took the seat, then a lot of criticism of Anthony Albanese's leadership.
So yesterday at the press conference, he was trying to stress, the personal factor. There was this 4% of voters, voting personally for Mike, I guess trying to downplay, the risk of not winning that seat. But for the government, surely they're on the back foot. I mean, can anyone forget the images of the Prime Minister during the bushfires in Barrow, which is a town in this electorate where people, refuse to shake his hand? I mean, do you think that is going to linger and have an impact in the election?
I think it will with some people, and the challenge, of course, for Scott Morrison is whether he can translate the personal bounce he's had in polling out of his handling of the health crisis into votes on the ground in this particular electorate. It's an electorate that's very concerned. It's diverse, but it's very concerned with having a member who can help it with getting services, getting infrastructure, getting facilities, and so on. So it will be looking for someone it thinks will give it a very strong local voice.
Okay, so let's look at the possible candidates then. John Barrow, the New South Wales Deputy Premier, looks like a front runner for the Nationals. What type of a candidate would he be?
I think he would be a strong candidate. His state seat is Queanbeyan. It's called Monaro, but it covers Queanbeyan, and he's very well known there. At the last state election, he won every booth in his electorate. So even though you would think it's a bit counterintuitive that a national would be so well supported in a big country town, a regional centre, nevertheless, I think that he does have a lot of popularity and certainly a lot of name recognition. Now, if he were elected, it would be particularly interesting because, of course, he wouldn't be coming to federal parliament to sit on the backbench forever. And I think his presence would put pressure on Michael McCormack, the Nationals leader. And certainly he's someone who has a loud voice and many opinions. So we'd be hearing from him a lot.
Of course, if he does run and is successful, that'll trigger a by-election at the New South Wales level as well. And I don't suppose particularly happy about that. I mean, her margin is quite slim as well.
Well, that's right. I think the New South Wales Premier would prefer that no one left the state parliament at the moment, but nevertheless, I think she might have to accept that happening. Of course, on the Liberal side, there's been talk of Andrew Constance, who was very active during the bushfires. His electorate overlaps the southern part of in Monaro, and he would be a strong candidate. However, I think in the end, we probably won't see him running.
Yeah, so the other Liberal candidate alternative is Senator Jim Molan. How popular do you think he'd be?
He lives in the electorate. We saw in the Senate race when he was pushed down the ticket but campaigned for himself that he gathers votes pretty effectively. Of course, subsequently he came in a casual vacancy. However, my feeling is in the end he wouldn't have much chance of winning the seat.
Okay, so the wild card potentially is Labor's candidate, Christy McBain, the Mayor of Bega. She's an alternative to two grey-haired men in suits. How well do you think she'll go?
I think she's popular in her area. I don't know how much support she'd have in Queanbeyan, but nevertheless, as someone who again was active in the bushfires, she obviously is probably the best bet that Labor can put up, and we'll start with a strong base.
Okay, so how is this by-election going to run? I mean, with social distancing restrictions in place, surely that's going to constrain both campaigning and the actual voting process. How's that going to work?
With more than ordinary by-election difficulty, obviously. But remember, it wouldn't be before probably late June, so there's a while to go, and the restrictions, I think, would have been eased by then, although they wouldn't have disappeared. But clearly there would be less on the ground campaigning by the leaders. That might be a bit of a relief to Scott Morrison, who had those problems during the fire season of people not wanting to shake his hands. Anthony Albanese this week quipped, well, at least he won't have that difficulty this time. But it will be a by-election with a difference. There'll be a lot of emphasis, I think, on postal votes, especially getting postal votes from older voters who either can't venture out or may not want to venture out at that time.
Okay, look, Michelle, thanks so much for your insights into all of that. I look forward to speaking to you again next week.
Thanks, Caroline.